And now onto our talk about insecure. When James and I first sat down to talk about the word insecure, he asked me, "What does insecure mean to you?" And I realized I hadn't actually thought about that. I probably should have, given that that was the word I was asking him to speak on. But as we slowly started to unpack the word insecure, its implications, its subtleties, its causes, I found that my definition started to shift and grow into new categories and areas of my life that I hadn't thought of before. And this type of reflection is so powerful in creating change and empowering ourselves and our world. I'd like to introduce James Meinart. James Meinart is a facilitator, educator, and trainer focused on ending racism, uprooting sexism, and addressing the ways in which oppression impacts our society. James consults with organizations as a part of Undue Bias Consulting. He's also the local director and organizer of the Men's Story Project, as well as an instructor at St. Louis University in the Women's and Gender Studies Department. James, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to stop sharing and let you have the screen.
All right, well, thank you, Sam, for that introduction and for having me here. I'm not the most comfortable on Zoom and like talking to a computer screen, but I just wanted to start real quick to get a better idea of who I'm here with. If you could type in the chat box for me, if you have access to that, like just your name, your pronouns, maybe your pet's name, in a current way you're creative, that would just like, you know, even if a few of you do it, that would just help me feel really like I'm more connected with the folks that I'm talking at. So for example, I'm James. I use he, him pronouns. My cat's name is Dora. And currently I've been making different flavors of ice cream like every week to make sure I gain weight during this quarantine so that I can survive the next pandemic. And I'm just going to read a few of those out when they start coming in. Yeah. Oh, Sam, she, her pronouns, starting to love paddle boarding. Lewis, he, him pronouns, has a dog named Truman and spending more time painting. We got Nicole, she, her pronouns, and the puppy in the picture with her is Cooper. Julie from New York City with a cat named Gus. Okay, thanks. That just makes you feel a little bit more like real people instead of little moving avatars. Rachel with a beagle named Jax building a garden. Ooh, I grew up with beagles, Rachel, so I just already feel like we're friends. Okay, so those are going to keep coming in, and I'm going to keep glancing over them and loving them, but I'm going to start telling you a little bit more about myself. Sam did a great introduction, but I also want you to know I'm an urban farmer. I'm a dad. I'm a musician. I'm an activist. I'm a community organizer. Beth is here with the cats Zuka and Zenny, also working on her garden right now. I have to share that. I love Zuka and Zenny. Maybe I hope I said those right. And some of my identities that are important. I'm white. I'm a man. I'm cisgender. I'm straight. I was raised in rural Missouri. I was raised Catholic. And I'm going to be talking a lot about identities today, not because I think that they're like the most important thing about any of us. And in a way, I don't think they tell you anything about me in particular, but they do tell us about the social forces and like the social conditioning that was probably directed at you. Like I said, I'm a farmer. And so I think about plants a lot and like what gets directed at them. So water, light, nutrients. Yeah, but like we've been thinking about humidity a lot here in Missouri, and unfortunately rodents. We get little mice that get into our greenhouse and eat our seeds and stuff like that, and so I get to notice just the way the world and all these forces directed at the plants shape the plants, and each plant ends up individually different than the other ones. They don't end up identical, but you can see the ways that they're shaped by these forces around them. And for me, I've learned that when I think about insecurity and my insecurities, I've been able to shift and learn about my own insecurities by thinking about my identities and the forces that were directed at me. So yeah, let's talk about being insecure and insecurities. Oh, yippee, my insecurities. I was like, ooh, what if we talk about everyone else's insecurities? But then I realized I didn't know you all well enough to put your business out there. So maybe I'll just tell you about my wife's insecurities because that sounds more fun. No, I'm kidding. But kind of seriously, because 10 years ago, I would have told you that I wasn't an insecure person, that I wasn't insecure, that to me, I had told Sam this already, to me, like kind of what insecure meant to me was like, you know, like the teenage girls that are wearing a lot of makeup because they've been told that they're not pretty, or the boys that feel like they really have to front and act cool. Like those people seem to me as insecure. And my wife was one of those girls at one point. But what I think my point is that was the type of insecurity I was taught to identify, and I think why is because we live in this male-dominated patriarchal culture, and so we're taught to look at you know, young girls as being insecure instead of seeing the ways that we have been made insecure. Luckily, I think I had enough of the right conversations, really patient people, patient mentors, that I'm now more concerned with my own insecurities and growing like through and past them, instead of just, you know, wanting to talk about other insecure people. Also, I've been, you know, I've clicked through some of your pictures and I looked at who all signed up. And so something that I think is true from looking at y'all and looking at your pictures is that many of y'all actually come from communities that are targeted by racism or have been targeted by homophobia and heteronormativity. Some of y'all, many of y'all inhabit bodies that have had like both sexism and transphobia directed at you. And I love thinking about the ways that we get to be creative, to put the bulk of your time into creative work and creative resistance to get to like live fully and enjoy your life as much as possible in the midst of this oppression coming at you. I don't have many of those identities that like have been targeted with oppression. I listed my identities, and I think for many of us, those places where we have been targeted by oppression, that's where we end up getting a lot of our insecurities. But really, there's so much learning and unlearning that we can do when we take on the ways that we've actually been set up as oppressors, as agents of systemic oppression in our society. There's so much learning we can do around like how that's shaped us. So a few examples are, you know, as an adult towards young people, right? Or as a Gentile towards Jews, or a Christian towards Muslims, or as an able-bodied person towards disabled people, or as a cisgender person towards trans people, a middle-class person towards working-class people, a non-immigrant towards immigrants, you know, and the myriad of other of these, you know, fault lines and oppression dynamics that shape our society. And I just think it's worth it for all of us, even those who inhabit very few oppressor identities, to dig into some of those, because it's important for us to see how they confused us, right? These, being raised in this oppressive society, these oppressor identities set up hierarchies in our mind. They lead us to think that some people are better and more valuable than other people. And as we work for justice, which I assume we're all doing in some way, shape, or form, because I think as humans, that's like inherently what we want. I think of the little kids when I worked in a preschool for a little while, like they know what justice is. And when you like do something unjust, they will scream about it, right? And so I know some of us lose some of that passion, but I think at the core of what makes us human is this desire for justice, and a lot of this gunk that we internalize from inhabiting and seeing these oppressor identities and oppressions play out. They mess up our minds and they mess up our movements for justice. So that's going to be an important part of us. And I'm going to have us do something that has been an important practice for me, and we're going to do a little mini version of it right now called a dyad. And dyads are just like, it's a trading of a listening time. And so you're only going to get 60 seconds to talk and 60 seconds to be a listener. And when you're a listener, your job is to just love and give listening attention to the other person. And when you're the talker, you just share where your mind goes, and vice versa. And we're trading, we're sharing that time. So one of you is going to go for 60 seconds listening, and then you're going to switch, and then you're going to be the talker, and the other person's going to switch. So I don't know, Matt, if you're the like guru right now with the internet and the groups, or Sam, if that's you, but whoever is, there's 24 of us. If you could just break us up into groups of 2, so 12 groups of 2, and if we were in person, I would just have you turn to your partner, but Zoom. And I'm going to ask you for just 60 seconds to talk about one of your identities that has had oppression directed at it. And so if you're like me and you don't occupy many, you can think about when you were a child and the way that adults often weren't thoughtful about you, or the way the world isn't set up to work well for young people and stuff like that. So maybe pull us all back in 2.5 minutes, so we just have time. And I'll ask you all just to time yourselves. You can pull out your phone, put a little 60-second timer on, and Sam, send us into breakout groups.
All right, I'm on it.
Thanks. Okay, well, I hope that was useful or nice or something for you, an experience at least. Sam had told me that part of Creative Mornings was also to build connection among the people. And so, and doing dyads is a practice I use in a lot of my facilitation exercises to get people talking to each other and also reflecting on yourself. And mostly you're just going to listen to me talk at you for the next like 20 minutes. So I just wanted you to get to use your own vocal cords a little bit. Okay, let's start where I want to talk about masculinity some. I'm going to start with a story. So when I was 14, I was living on a farm in rural Missouri, and like cows, corn, beans, like that kind of farm, right? And there was one day where my mom was working in the garden. She was digging up potatoes. And my dad really didn't want to see my mom out there working by herself. And so he came to tell me to come work in the garden. And I think that same day, my older sister, who could drive at this point because she was 17, was driving into town. We lived about 20 minutes from town, and I had the chance to maybe get a ride with her and see some friends. And I was like, no, Dad, like, I'm not working in the garden. Like, I want to go into town. And my dad was like, no, you are working in the garden. And so I like went out to the garden and started like digging, and like just got really upset. I was in my 14-year-old feelings about this, and I like threw down the shovel. And I remember my dad got like really mad, and he like stepped up to me and he was like, oh, what? You want to fight about this? Do you want to fight me? Like, do you think you're a man? And we didn't fight because I was a small little like 100-pound nothing boy. And so I ran away from my dad, like no joke, and ran inside. And the rest of that memory is blank. I probably cried. I don't remember. But that memory sticks out for me because there was a way that my manhood was important to my dad, and his own manhood in like establishing like masculinity as like dominance over me. And when I reflect on my entire childhood, I can see like a pattern of that, right? Like I was raised in a household where anytime my dad didn't really like something I did, like I got whoopings, but sometimes the violence escalated beyond that. And one time he actually punched me when I was 8 years old, which now as an adult, like it seems extremely young to have that kind of violence directed at you. But we were playing kickball in my backyard, and we had neighbors over, and my dad was playing, and something happens. I don't remember what it was, but I knew it wasn't fair. I was like really upset about this unfairness. And I ran inside to my house, and I was crying on my bed, and I was kicking the wall. I was like so mad. And my dad walked in, and he punches me in the side, and he says, "Don't kick my walls." And then he walked out. And I tell these stories because I think they're like some of the most poignant memories that have stood out to me that I've done work on myself and like counseling, when I try to think about why gender, why some of these identities are so important to me and how they've shaped me. But uh, but I also not empathize, but I understand my dad better now than I did then, right? My dad wanted to make sure that I grew up to be a man so that I could survive in this world that really targets, gay men who are more effeminate, or other just effeminate men, like you don't have the same opportunities. And we were raised in the country where if you weren't tough, like, people were coming for you, right? And so a man in his eyes was someone who was tough, didn't cry, was an individual. You had to be able to stand up for others, protect women, work hard, do a physical job. But like also in our family, like go to church, provide for your family, go hunting, play sports. But like none of those things really went well for me. Like I was bad at hunting, I was bad at sports. Yeah, it's just like all these ideas of what like I should be left me somewhat insecure about who I was, insecure about my masculinity or lack thereof, really. Like I wasn't that athletic, and when I left home for college, despite like 100 hunting trips that I had gone on with my dad and my grandpa and my brothers, I had literally not killed a single animal, because I was bad at it. And like I still always, and to this day, hug and kiss my mom goodnight. Like I just always did that. I was just like always a smart kid, like and kind of sweet, and just loved math, and I loved science, and I was a geek, and I loved video games, and I loved drawing, and I loved playing music and listening to music and writing music and singing music. And these weren't really manly traits, so my dad always kind of discouraged them. Um, in fact, I remember one time when I was 16, I was like really getting into the guitar, and I was planning my whole life. I was going to be like a touring musician because like they were the most awesome people in the world. And I remember my dad being like, like that's a stupid idea. There's no money in that. Like you should quit the guitar and do something that actually makes money. And yeah, just that way that he crushed, like, or would try to crush my creative outlets around this idea of what it means to be a man. Yeah, okay. Well, I have random other stories popping in my head, but I'll just keep going. But so despite like having this dad that had these like really rigid gender norms, I don't actually think I was like that insecure about myself. For the first 11 years of my life, I hadn't faced much harshness in the world except for from my dad. But we moved when I was 11, and we moved from one small, poor rural town to another rural town, and we bought a farm. But this rural town was like 20 minutes from more of like a middle-class town, and where my parents sent me to a Catholic school. And it was at this Catholic school where I really started questioning everything about myself. Like my classmates would pick on me. A lot of things they like really picked on was like my haircut. My mom always cut my hair growing up. That was more affordable. I had this accent, like I had this like rural Missouri, like, we'll do things again, we'll do it there, whatever. Like, I had this accent like that I came from like Southern country Missouri. I had a nose that I guess was worth making fun of. It was slightly large for like a sixth grader. I don't know. And thrift store clothes and Payless shoes and whatever. And kids pick on each other for all kinds of things. Like I was a part of that, picking on like my classmates also. But there was bullying directed at me too. Like I remember one day, 3 of the cool boys had like stayed after like class transition, and they're like, "Hey James, we want to like talk to you." And so of course I'm like, "Oh yeah, love these cool boys want to talk to me." And they like kind of crowded around me, and 2 of them were in front of me, and secretly one of them got on their hands and knees behind me. And as soon as that happened, one of them just like shoved me, and so I just like fell back and like hit my head, and they just like got up laughing and like walked away. And looking back, I can tell they picked on me because I was weird. Like I didn't fit in. And that wasn't the main problem. The main problem was I didn't care. Like I didn't care to try to fit in, so I didn't try to fit in. And I wasn't insecure about myself, because like the town where I'd grown up before, like everyone was poor. Like my closest friends lived in trailer parks, like, and so we were all just like weird, and we weren't trying to like assimilate and fit into this like white middle class American culture as much. And I did make friends in that Catholic school because there were other weird boys who were also kind of like the working class poor boys from maybe like broken homes. And they took me into their friend circle, and we would play Foursquare and like, and I just want to name them because they're important to my sense of like that connection that's also possible. So there was Matt, there was Dane, there was Justin, there was Jeremy, and they really helped me survive sixth grade. Um, but uh, but the bullying and the picking on really had a lasting effect on me, and I started developing these insecurities. So I tried to get a cool haircut, and I changed the way that I talked, and I succeeded in many ways, and I assimilated to the culture that was there. I tried to be popular, so I wanted to hang out with the cool kids, and I gradually stopped hanging out with the boys that were my friends as much because I knew that I couldn't be associated with them if I wanted to be cool. And I stopped drawing as much as I had loved drawing because the cool kids thought drawing wasn't cool, right? Um, and and really, when I look back, I know I was trying to survive being targeted in a way, but there's still a lot of grief I have for acting on, for not being able to like, you know, maintain the friendships and like survive to myself, like be true to myself. I want to pause for just a second here, and I'm going to ask you to think to yourself like about your own insecurities. Like we're going to take 30 seconds. Like, what are you insecure about? Like, is it a physical trait, like because you got picked on for this or that, or is it like, you know, a personal or creative trait? And then are there ways that you still hide to avoid that insecurity being seen? Because I think that's what I realized was that when my stuff got targeted, I started hiding things. So yeah, I'm just gonna pause. Okay. Um, Something I didn't realize until much more recent in my life was that some of my sense, some of my insecurities were because some of my very self, my identities had actually been hidden from me. Because up until now, I've been talking mostly about like being raised a boy and masculinity and being like more rural working class. Um, but a key identity of mine also is being white. And there's a way that I can tell now that my whiteness actually protected me from a lot of brutality. If I had been an Arab boy or a black boy that came into that same all-white Catholic school, like I think the brutality would have like been a whole lot more. But I also think, you know, as a white person, I didn't think about being white because as white people, we don't talk about being white. We think of it as just the normal way of being. And I also had colorblind parents who kind of thought that if we just pretended race didn't exist, then it wouldn't keep causing so much pain. They were wrong. But something interesting that I also know is that like when I lived in that rural, small, poor town up until I was 11, I don't remember hearing any like racist jokes. But in that middle class Catholic school that I but when we moved to, like, I do remember like hearing racist jokes, and they confused me at first because, like I said, I had been raised by these like colorblind parents. You know, everyone like belongs, and like a lot of Sesame Street diversity, right? And our best friends, the family that my family hung out with like every Sunday, like growing up, and we went over to their house, and our house was a Latino family, Doug and Celinda and Lilani and Ashley. and this isn't for me to say that there wasn't racism in that small town. I'm sure you can still find Confederate flags there, and there was anti-blackness and lots of white privilege. Just that my parents did their best to shelter it from me and hide ideas of race from me, right? So when I was in middle school and I started hearing these racist jokes, I wasn't okay with them. But then because of the bullying and the targeting, I was too insecure to actually do or say anything about them. It was only later, well, my one memory of doing something, so I have some yeah, I was a junior in high school, and I was strangely on the football team. Even though it was junior varsity because I was a small person, and there was a sophomore who was also on the junior varsity team, and he was a linebacker. He probably weighed 130 pounds more than me, and I overheard him telling a racist joke, and just something flared up in me, and I knew that like I had this position above him as like a junior or something, and I had to assert my like dominance, my male masculine dominance, and I grabbed him around the neck by his shirt, and I told him I don't want to hear those jokes anymore. And I don't tell you that because I'm proud. I tell you that because in a way I'm ashamed of the many times before that I did nothing. But I don't blame 13-year-old James for not knowing what to do about racism. I mean, I grew up in our, what I consider now a white supremacist culture. And I don't mean white supremacists like the KKK and shaved heads and stuff like that, but like white supremacy where whiteness just reigns supreme. So like white culture, white food, white TV shows, white magazines, like white middle class ways of speaking are all deemed normal and correct and the best. And like white people are just like, we subtly and not so subtly see ourselves as supreme. And I think the jokes were one of the ways that boys reinforced that idea. And it took me until I was an adult to realize that I was very insecure about something around whiteness. And it wasn't necessarily my identity as a white person, although I do think a lot of white people are fragile about that. And when it gets challenged, we get really anxious and, in our feelings. But rather, I was insecure about challenging white supremacy culture, right? Challenging the white norms, challenging the white culture standards that were around me, and like refusing to cooperate with any of the social conditioning that, even as it benefits me, is harmful to other people. But when I was in my mid-20s, I got into this social change organization focused on social change and peer counseling, where I was really challenged to unearth and examine my own social conditioning as both a man and a white person and all of my other identities. And I had this friend, Steven, who got me into the organization. And we hung out a lot. We worked on bicycles together, and we ran a school garden together. And so we decided that we would meet up once a week, and we would trade time. We would do a dyad like I had you all do earlier, but much longer, usually like 30 to 40 minutes. And we would spend time with our stories and with our feelings. And we had decided we would focus always on our internalized like racism and sexism. So the ways that we had gotten that gunk in our brains from the society, and we didn't want it in there, but we didn't actually think that just like, pretending it wasn't there and hiding it all the time actually like made it go away. And so we would have these like dyads and these little sessions, and we would kind of like poke each other's fragility and challenge each other to be better. And I do think it really made a huge difference in how we showed up in the public better. And all of this was right on time, because in this time around 2012, I had joined an organization called the Organization for Black Struggle, which was founded by Black people and was focused on Black liberation, but welcomed anyone that was committed to that. And that was just because I had read that, for white people to really be anti-racist, we should be backing Black-led organizations. And I was just like, okay. And I just Google searched one and joined it. But that led to a lot of relationships and connections. And I ended up joining this other organization that was for white allies, white accomplices that were working on ending racism. And then Ferguson happened. Mike Brown was shot and killed. And everything changed in the St. Louis activist world and St. Louis in general. And my white family and friends were acting foolish all around me, you know, saying things like, well, all lives matter, and I was having these arguments with my mom still about how she doesn't see race, and I was like, well, that's silly, Mom, and and so all of my white fragility and like this stuff was really up for me, and I knew that and so I realized I just needed a way to kind of like dig into this stuff and root it out more for myself so that I could show up better in these spaces that I was like moving in. And so I contacted one of the local leaders of my this like social change and peer counseling organization to see if we could have a group for white people working on ending racism, because I was already a part of a group for men working against sexism and patriarchy. And he said, yeah, we can have that kind of group, but you're going to have to lead it. And I was like, well, I don't want to do that. I need the group. I want the group for me. I need to learn. And he was like, yeah, well, you'll learn more if you actually take on the leadership and lead it. And I didn't think I was capable, and in many ways I actually wasn't, but it was actually a really good group of people to practice on. There was like 6 of us, and we met monthly. And so I would start panicking like 2 days before we would meet, and I would like start frantically reading like, you know, A New Jim Crow or like, you know, Witnessing Whiteness or some book so that I had something smart to say. And we would just like get together, and we would have these dyads in this group and discuss these issues and really push each other to do better and take bolder steps against racism. And that group was really great for me. And I ended up in other similar groups also. But what they did was like, I still felt insecure around challenging whiteness. But I was starting to catch courage from other people. And I was also starting to feel more accountable, like knowing that like if I was like, you know, at work, this thing is going on and I'm going to try to do this to help against the racism at work, people would be like, okay. And then the next month when we met, they would ask me, how did that go? You know, and it doesn't feel good to be like, oh, well, since I'm white, I let another month go by without saying anything about it because, you know, I was able to. And so that accountability like really made a difference. And in the last few years, a lot of this internal work that I had been doing started really coming to fruition. So Sam and I met initially, Samantha, who brought me here because of the Men's Story Project. And the Men's Story Project is, it's an international program to have people who identify with maleness in any way share their stories about how masculinity's affected their life or how they've, you know, been complicit in like being dominant and aggressive and like reinforcing like male domination. And when I met the founder, Dr. Josie Lair, at a conference, I was like, oh, that seems cool. She's like, you should lead one in St. Louis, do it. And I was like, why does this keep happening to me? But I did. I was like, okay. And so I organized it and directed, produced the whole thing. And it was amazing, and it was so great, and something that I loved about the Men's Story Project. And so I did it in 2019, no, we're in 2020 right now, 2018, 2019. We're skipping 2020 because, you know, global pandemic. But something that I loved about both years is that the men, they kind of show up feeling really insecure about sharing their stories. And yet through sharing our stories, like sharing what we've gone through and what we've done to others, like they start becoming more secure in themselves, right? Like the insecurity that led us to doing the things that we felt like we needed to do to prove ourselves starts disappearing, and we get to just be ourselves. And then around the same time, I was working in an organization where I was leading groups with teenage boys around these same topics, and we hired a new supervisor for myself. I got a new supervisor, and I started building a friendship with her, and it became one of the most important relationships in my life. So that woman, Zanique Gardner, is a Black woman, and at this time, I had figured out enough about my own insecurities as a man, as a white person, to understand that it was important for me to really back her leadership and to support her in this position. So often people of color, but especially Black people in particular, are undermined in any positions of leadership, and white men in particular are really skilled at undermining Black women. And so I'll be honest, it took her a long time to start trusting me and to see me as someone trustworthy. But she did start eventually engaging with me and asking for my opinion and perspectives. And I mean, women in general are taught to be insecure about their own ability to think well, and they don't trust their own minds so much, right? That's just what they've been taught. And so I do think it's helpful for us as men to really back their thinking, and support them for a long time, even if it's years before they start really looking and engaging with our thinking also. So now, 5 years later, neither of us work at that agency where we met anymore, but we do run our own business together, which Sam mentioned, Undue Bias Consulting. And it was started really when Zanique was asked to come speak to a group of mostly white teachers at a school district about race and racism. And she was like, James, like, you do all that stuff talking to white people about whiteness and racism, like, you need to come with me. Like, and I was like, okay. And that was great. And like, she got paid and I didn't. And like, I was like, this is perfect. This feels like, somewhat of like implementing justice, right? And now we have a small business, and we have clients in like multiple states they were consulting with to support them to implement anti-racism practices in their organizations. And I still do all of the same practices that I have told you about, where I, have like weekly dyads, and I like work intentionally on like the ways that I've been raised as a man, the ways that I've been raised as a white person, so that stuff doesn't get in the way of doing this work. I think it's more important now that I'm like consulting on it and leading men in the Men's Story Project, not less important, because that's the stuff that comes at you is in my face all the time. Yeah. Okay. I don't know. I'm probably out of time. I'm going to tell one final story. So one of those sessions that I had with my friend Steven really stands out to me. One of those longer dyads, because it was actually in the week or two after Mike Brown was killed. And I had been in Ferguson protesting, and seen the tanks and the tear gas and the pepper spray, and protesters were getting like shot by rubber bullets. And I was starting, like 10 days in or so, I was starting to feel really discouraged and defeated already by just how crazy the state's response was to these protests. And so in my dyad with Stephen, I'm talking about that. And then I just start talking about Jeremy, that boy that befriended me in 6th grade, who took me into their friend group when no one else did. Because when I had been 22, Jeremy had been shot and killed by the police. And when my mom told me about that, I had just kind of gone numb. I was, like, wow, that's crazy. But now here I was, like years and years later, and I was just sobbing about it. I was just sobbing as hard as I had cried since I was probably a toddler, and angry, so angry at the police for taking my friend's life, for taking Mike Brown's life, and just sad about our society and for the racism and sexism and all this oppression that keeps us from living like the big, beautiful human lives that I think are possible. And after that session, I noticed I felt a little less numb. I felt a little less discouraged. Even after all the years of looking at this stuff and doing these groups on it, I still hadn't been aware of how much I was still just kind of holding inside and not holding up to the light. And being a little less numb, I was able to keep going, keep facing these things, keep working for justice. And so what I've learned, and I want to share with you, is that the things that you're insecure about can actually be signposts to areas of unawareness that you have, unawareness around the many ways that oppression has shaped you and shaped the world around you. And I think I want to encourage you to explore those areas. Insecurities don't feel good, I know, but they can lead to the insights and ways that you can actually contribute to a more just world.
Thank you so much, James. So many great stories. I loved it. Let's see some love in the chat or some hands for James. See you there, Julie. Thanks for joining
Hey,
us.
Lewis.
We're going to open it up for some questions now. So if you guys would like to ask James a question, please just send us a message in the chat and then we'll ask you to unmute.
Yeah, I love unmuted. I love being able to hear other humans and like movement and sniffles and stuff like that. So
Feels more real, right?
anyone can unmute, even if you just want to be like clearing your throat. Thanks, Rachel.
I'll
Thanks,
start with a
Nicole.
question, I guess.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you talked a lot about, these insecurities, and it seems like a lot of these are stemming from oppression or just from society, right? I mean, is that where you're seeing, does that what you think insecurity comes from? Society, norms, and oppression?
Yeah, I think that underlies all of it, really. And like I said about plants, like your specific, I think these oppressions are directed at all of us, and some of us, and we take them in different ways, right? We take them in. Some of us absorb them. Some of us like chop them up and dissect them, like I do. Some of us just like ride them to CEO ships because it's like this is great, right? But I think like each of us has our own particular individual stories that if we are able to, we can tie back to these larger systemic things. And I think doing that is useful for us to say like, okay, like my entry point is like, oh, I notice I have this insecurity about the way I talk. Like, and so I try to talk different, or I have this insecurity about the way my hair looks, right? Well, if I take the time and process that, maybe I'll go back and realize, oh yeah, there was kids that made fun of me in middle school for my hair. And then I realize, oh, right, there was class dynamics that were going on, like from these social oppressions that say like, you're supposed to assimilate and fit in with this middle class world. So yeah, I don't know, Sam, I don't want to simplify it like in like, erase all of the like particularities of each person's story and like how it works for them, but I do think that that's true, that like these bigger social forces end up shaping a lot of our individual stories.
When you talk about it, I feel like it's like an onion and you have to peel it back to find the root cause, no matter what it is. Or even maybe like, I mean, I hate to say it like this, but like maybe like a cancer or something, where if you don't dissipate it or dissect it, it's just gonna remain,
Yeah, for sure. I like both of the analogies, onions and cancer. But I mean, the reason that like, I mean, the reason we have trouble recognizing it as a cancer a lot of times is because our society is also set up to like, if you are like me and you are white and a man and straight and cis and blah, 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 like you actually are like, you rise up in the society, like you're given all these like escalators of opportunity. And so it can be harder, I all the time have to check myself and be like, no, wait a second, am I getting this opportunity because like, blah, 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 blah. And so, yeah. So I do think it's a cancer, and I do think we'd all be better off if we didn't have social oppressions that led to insecurities that hold us back in many ways. But I also think it's hard to recognize.
Right.
What about other folks? I don't need questions. I love to just hear your minds and like any thoughts that came up for you, like listening. Anyone that didn't like leave in the middle of it, if you turned your video on, that would be great. Julie, thanks for showing up. I appreciate that.
I've got one. This is Matt.
Okay, Matt.
I want to attempt to wrap my head around this whole ball of confusion right now, but stick with me.
That's okay.
You started off with saying you were shaped by certain forces. Now, the forces for good or for bad, and what I've learned over my life so far, some of the people that that shaped my life wouldn't have potentially shaped it in the way they had, because if they hadn't had potentially positive or even negative forces they've used for good.
Sure.
A lot of my life has been shaped by more assertive and masculine women, in fact, and they had to come through a certain amount of negativity. And what I found is they would they want to bring people in, and they become very paternal in a way, in a good way, and helping you out. That shaped me. You know, you talk about insecurity. My insecurity, you might identify with this, is the whole bullying. You get really good at identifying a situation before it happens, calming yourself down to get yourself out of it. Now, that's a big negative that I had to go through that, but the positive is I feel that I can handle a situation more calmly than when something happens instantly than maybe a set of others. So I'm trying to flip this on its head a little bit of like,
sure, Matthew.
looking at positives for some of these negatives.
Sure. Here's what I'd say to that. So I think humans, like, we're extremely resilient and capable of learning and growing from like all the situations we're in, right? And we end up living in these worlds where we're coping like with the things that we've had to internalize in the processes, right? So that like we live on edge just a little bit for like a moment where that bully might be coming for me again, you know, like, and that's fine. And it gives us these skills that help us survive in this world. And what I believe in is that we don't have to settle for that we can be living in this world with the resilience and the skills that we have, and we can also be actively working to transform this world into one that, you know, for 7 generations in the future, like, people are living fuller lives, and because that's what I think is possible. So there's like that stereotype that like if an artist isn't depressed, they're not creating good art, and like I just don't think that's true. I actually think if that artist wasn't depressed, they'd be creating more great art, right? There's like a difference between
Particularly, they'd be creating different art.
Maybe also, right? But I there's a difference between like our humanness, and then like the stuff that like the baggage we carry and like all that kind of stuff. And sometimes both help us survive in the world that we're in. But like I want us to like interrogate all this baggage and get rid of as much as it can, so as much of our inherent humanness can flourish in the world that we're in. That's kind of how I frame it. So like for these women, like I think women are inherently powerful and feminine and masculine and all of these things, and that our society usually tries to shape them into one way to succeed in our society. And a lot of women succeed in having more of their full selves. And so we're like, whoa, look how masculine and like confident that woman is, because she wasn't squashed into like just a partial version of herself, right? And to me, that's like just an expression of her full humanness. I don't know. Those are some of my thoughts on that.
Okay.
It's like 9:30. Anyone else?
Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We have events once a month, so please follow us. We're on Facebook, Instagram, all of the medias. If you guys have any comments or questions, you can always email us at stlouis@creativemornings.com, and we look forward to the next talk. Thank you so much, James. This was amazing.
Stay in.
Bye, guys. See you next month.